wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
We did something after the Second World War that no country in history has ever done. We rehabilitated our enemies. You won't find that in history anywhere.
In 1945, working with the newly formed United Nations, President Truman funded relief efforts in Europe. He sent General Douglas MacArthur to defeated Japan to demilitarize that former enemy and then help build a democratic government. The United States would pour aid into Japan, giving food, clothing, medicine, and other supplies.
The leadership of the free world, that's the role of the United States. And if they go at it right, and they will, it will never be lost because we're trying to do the right thing.
But even as the United States was trying to do the right things overseas, its former ally, the Soviet Union, was causing more and more alarm. Under its leader, Joseph Stalin, instead of taking a part in the post-war rebuilding, Russia was swallowing up the nations of Eastern Europe. In March 1946, 1 year into his presidency, Harry Truman asked England's great wartime leader, Winston Churchill, if he would speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Churchill was eager to travel there, for he had something to say, and he knew the world would be listening.
A shadow had fallen from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Churchill was the first to speak of an iron curtain, and that iron curtain was Soviet communism. Communism proclaimed itself as a system to spread equality, but in fact, it gave power to a select few and deprived the millions under its influence of individual rights and freedom. People behind its curtain became prisoners of the Soviets. And though Joseph Stalin was mainly interested in securing Eastern Europe, to Churchill and Truman, he seemed out to conquer the world.
The threat of world conquest by Soviet Russia endangers our liberty and endangers the kind of world in which the free spirit of men can survive.
In early 1947, communist-led revolts erupted in Greece and Turkey. Truman reacted with a fateful speech.
Something had to be done at once, or the Eastern Mediterranean would be taken over by the communists. On March 12th, I went before the Congress and stated our determination to help the people of Greece and Turkey maintain their independence.
Truman's speech, in which he announced a strong new policy against communism, marked the beginning of what would be known as the Cold War.
In 1947, President Truman announced what came to be called the Truman Doctrine, which committed the United States to the containment of communism throughout the world. And in that speech, he used the word free or freedom about 25 times. And indeed, during the Cold War, the notion of the free world came to the fore. We were defending the free world. Our freedoms were in contradistinction to the lack of freedoms in the communist world. Unfortunately, any division of the world into two parts tends to overlook a lot of gray areas in between. To say that everybody who is on our side is part of the free world and everybody who's on the other side is part of the slave world ignored many violations of freedom within the free world.
In 1948, Truman launched an ambitious new plan to send billions in American aid to our allies in Europe to help speed up the rebuilding of those war-torn nations. It was called the Marshall Plan, after Secretary of State George C. Marshall, but it reflected Truman's desire to spread freedom and prosperity.
I have a deep and abiding faith in the destiny of free men. With patience and courage, we shall someday move on into a new era, a wonderful golden age, and do away with poverty and human misery everywhere on earth.
It was also becoming increasingly clear to Truman in the 1940s that he would have to do something about addressing freedom at home. In the 1940s, the United States was a Jim Crow nation. Jim Crow was a character in an old minstrel song, and his name had come to stand for racial segregation. In the South, everything was segregated. Schools, buses, restaurants, theaters, restrooms, water fountains, even soda machines. And though African Americans had fought in World War II as hard as anyone else, the Army, Navy, and Air Force were all still segregated. A young black man expressed the mounting anger of his race.
The Army Jim Crows us. The Navy lets us serve only as mess men. The Red Cross refuses our blood. Employers and labor unions shut us out. We are disenfranchised, Jim Crowed, spat upon.
In Mississippi, when some black soldiers returned home after serving overseas, they were dumped from trucks and then beaten. In Georgia, a black man was shot and killed simply because he had voted. And lynchings continued throughout the South. When President Truman heard of these outrages, he decided it was time to do something about civil rights. Truman sent proposals to Congress to stop lynchings, to outlaw the poll tax that kept many blacks from voting, and to end segregation in the armed forces. And he created a Commission on Civil Rights, calling their report An American Charter of Human Freedom.
We can't be the leaders of the free world and draw a color line on opportunity.
That we can't go before the world and try to maintain peace in the world when we ourselves at home discriminate against people on account of color or religion.
In 1947, Truman helped launch a remarkable traveling exhibition. The Freedom Train was a red, white, and blue railroad car that crisscrossed the country, carrying more than 100 freedom documents for Americans to see for themselves. At the center of the exhibit was the handwritten Declaration of Independence, which had been locked away from the public since the outbreak of World War II.
This song is a train song where the engineer's uncle sang.
Here comes the freedom train. You better hurry down.
Here, beside the original Constitution, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and the Emancipation Proclamation, visitors were invited to sign a freedom scroll. At Truman's insistence, the train did not permit segregated viewing. Stopping in 47 southern cities without a single racial incident, it was hailed as a forerunner of integration. The South wasn't the only place in America that was segregated in the 1940s. Though the rest of the country wasn't as blatant about it, separation and racial prejudice existed there too. And when it came to the national pastime, baseball, there were the major leagues, the minor leagues, and there were separate Negro leagues for ball players of color. White major leaguers played in fine ballparks, traveled first class, and slept in decent hotels. Leaguers had no ballparks of their own and usually got lower pay. Equipment was shabby, the travel brutal, and blacks almost always had trouble finding hotel rooms or restaurants. One white man who understood how wrong it was to keep baseball segregated was Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He knew that black ball players were a pool of inexpensive talent and were enthusiastic about playing in the major leagues. Ricky knew they would bring in a whole new audience. He decided he was going to change baseball.
I was convinced then that there was a timeliness about it. After waiting 100 years, these people legally free, not spiritually free, never morally free. But if the right man and ability on the field and with control of himself off the field, if I could find that kind of a man, the American public would accept him.
And then Branch Rickey found Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Jackie Robinson had earned letters in 4 sports at UCLA. He had done well in school, and he had always stood up for his beliefs. As an officer in the Army, Robinson had once refused to move when a driver asked him to sit in the back of a bus. Rickey was impressed. He invited Robinson to New York City and told him he wanted him to break baseball's color line. But he had to promise to hold his temper and not to fight back, no matter what happened.
I'm certainly delighted with my contract, and I'll certainly do my very best on the field.
I'm very sure you will.
On April 15, 1947, Jackie Robinson batted in Brooklyn for the first time as a major leaguer.
Jackie Robinson hit that ball. It went zooming across the left field wall. Yeah, ball. Yes, Jackie hit that ball.
But when the Dodgers visited Philadelphia, things turned ugly. The Phillies spewed hate language at Robinson. Runners began sliding into Jackie and cutting him with their spikes. Pitchers threw at his head, but Robinson kept his word.
No player in the history of baseball, I think, was ever subjected to the vile baitings from opposing benches, the basely unkind criticisms in print. He played admirably in spite of it all. He really turned the other cheek. He is a credit to baseball and to America.
These are the early days of the civil rights movement. This is a time when President Truman is making a big campaign to expand the civil rights of black Americans. Jackie Robinson becomes a national hero even to people who are not in favor of black civil rights. But his dignity, the way he stood up under pressure, under very severe racial taunting and insult, it was a symbol of what could be accomplished. And his talent and ability indicated that obviously there was no difference between blacks and whites in their abilities if people are given a chance. So it was one important moment on this road toward far greater equality within our society.
In his rookie season, Jackie Robinson finished first in the league in stolen bases and second in runs scored. He tied for the team lead in home runs. In September, the Dodgers won the National League pennant. Robinson had won the affection and respect of his fellow ball players and of the nation.
From my own personal experiences on the baseball diamond, that the feeling of intolerance no longer exists. The brotherhood movement is gaining ground every day. It is slowly and surely becoming a fact and not remaining just a theory.
By 1949, during Truman's second term, there was a new fear in America. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atom bomb. The United States had thought it was alone in having atomic weapons. Now the idea that Joseph Stalin had the A-bomb terrified Americans. In that same year, communists took over China. Then North Korea, encouraged by communist China and the Soviet Union, sent an army into South Korea. Truman, working with the United Nations, decided to stop them.
If we let the Republic of Korea go under, some other country would be next, and then another. And all the time, the courage and competence of the free world would be ebbing away.
Though war was never declared, it became known as the Korean War, in which 2 million Koreans and more than 50,000 Americans would die.
In Korea, our men are fighting as valiantly as Americans have ever fought, because they know they are fighting in the same cause of freedom in which Americans have stood ever since the beginning of this republic.
Back home, Truman had initiated a sweeping program to root out supposed communists inside the U.S. government. Across the nation, anti-communist hysteria began to spread in cities, universities, and private companies. The atmosphere, which came to be known as the Red Scare, led to the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Are you now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin waved a piece of paper and said it contained the names of 205 communists who worked in the State Department. McCarthy began a witch hunt for communists across the country. He said Hollywood was filled with them. Eventually, hearings were held at which he accused hundreds of people of communist activity.
I am not and never have been a communist.
Continue in this particular...
Have you ever been a member of the Communist
I believe
Party?
I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
McCarthy never proved a single case, but his attacks were devastating. Those he accused lost jobs and friends and careers. Their lives were ruined.
This so-called McCarthy period, which actually is much more than just one person, was a period of a great deal of hysteria about supposed communist influence and subversion and infiltration in the United States. The Communist Party of the United States was a tiny group with only a few thousand members. It didn't pose any threat to the stability of the American government. The McCarthy period demonstrates that civil liberties are always fragile. They're in our Constitution, they're in our laws, but at times of crisis, it's very easy for them to be weakened, and we must always be very vigilant. And the people who need civil liberties the most are those who hold unpopular views.
A senator from Maine, Margaret Chase Smith, finally had the courage to speak out against Joseph McCarthy.
I think it is high time we remembered that the Constitution speaks not only of the freedom of speech, but also of trial by jury instead of trial by accusation.
And President Truman, a longtime McCarthy foe, also weighed in.
Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police. That's what some people would like to do. We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. In short, we're not going to end democracy. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books.
After reaching a consensus, the Senate would vote to censure McCarthy for outrageous behavior. The man who had terrorized much of the nation was, in the end, disgraced. In 1952, the Republican Party selected the great general of World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as its candidate for president.
You have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world.
Running on a promise to end the war in Korea, Eisenhower became the first Republican president in 20 years. In 1953, Eisenhower fulfilled his promise and brought the fighting in Korea to an end. Times were good in the 1950s, but not for everyone. Ever since the Supreme Court's decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, segregation had been legal in schools, restaurants, hotels, and public places throughout the nation. Separate but equal was the law. But then in the 1950s came a major challenge to that Supreme Court ruling, and it all began with a 7-year-old girl. Linda Carol Brown lived in Topeka, Kansas. She had to walk across railroad tracks and take an old bus to get to school, even though there was a better school 5 blocks from her house. Linda couldn't go to that school because she was black, and the schools in Topeka were segregated. In 1951, Linda's father, the Reverend Oliver Brown, went to court to try to do something about it. Their case became known as Brown v. Board of Education, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, the great-grandson of a slave, was the lawyer who read the opening statement in the case. It was December 9th, 1952.
Ever since the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro has been trying to get the same status as anybody else, regardless of race.
Did segregation break the rules of the Constitution? Marshall and the lawyers for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People said it did. They said the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed all citizens equal privileges under the law, made the doctrine of separate but equal unconstitutional. Marshall said that segregated schools could never be truly equal because separating people based on race made them feel unequal and inferior.
Like a cancer, segregation destroys the morale of our citizens and disfigures our country throughout the world.
A year passed. It looked as if the court might be split. That would mean no decision in the case, and segregation could legally continue in America. Then, President Eisenhower named a new Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. He was Earl Warren, the former governor of California. 7 months after he assumed the bench, the waiting in the historic case was finally over. On May 17, 1954, Chief Justice Warren read the court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education.
Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe it does. We conclude unanimously that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
Brown versus Board of Education was a milestone in the history of American law. This overturned a decision from more than 50 years previously, Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed racial segregation. It didn't desegregate the schools very rapidly at all. Legal decisions don't do that. It requires people acting to overturn injustice. But it put the government on record as no longer willing to support the racial segregation of the South.